Hi Year 10, welcome to this week's episode of your English Literature podcast. We're talking to you today about the poem Sing by Daljit Nagra. With you today you have Miss Beaumont,
Mr. Rafi,
and Mr. Singh.
So you need to make sure that you've read through the poem and you've got a copy in front of you before you listen to the rest of the podcast, please. So if you need to, pause the podcast now and take a minute to go and get everything that you need. Okay, so we thought we'd start off today by talking a little bit about the poem overall, what we think it's about, and then moving into thinking about how it might link to the writer's life. So who'd like to start us off today?
So you can see that it's following the life of an Indian British young man who's just recently married, running his father's shop, probably a corner shop, and his struggles with dealing with his family, his new bride, and also the shop, which he has to stay all day from 9 o'clock to 9 o'clock. And we can see the frustrations that he deals with on a day-to-day basis.
It's also about the conflict between romantic love and family duty. And the clashing of the two, like Eastern and Western cultures.
Yeah, definitely. And also, as well as that, there's a sort of undercurrent about how difficult it is being an immigrant to the UK, and in particular being an immigrant in perhaps the early part of the 20th century, when England was much less multicultural a country than it is today, and some of the challenges and some of the prejudices that the speaker faces on the surface of things. So to link in a little bit about context then, there's quite a lot that we could say for this poem. So Daljit Nagra was the son of immigrants, and he's from an Indian background as well. So we can imagine that some of the cultural expectations that he faced growing up, potentially some of the cultural expectations that the speaker is talking about in this poem, expectations around a work ethic and working very, very hard, expectations about sticking to the cultural identity and following the cultural practices of your family, and the conflicts that you have when you're a young person in a country where the predominant culture is different to that to your family. Anything else about Daljit Nagra? I think his parents were shopkeepers, is that right?
Yeah.
So we can see in the poem that there is a mention of how he runs his daddy's shop, the speaker in the poem. So the fact that we've got the mention of shopkeepers in the poem as well, again, that's another hint that perhaps this is an autobiographical poem. It's a poem that's perhaps based on his own life experiences or inspired by them. They don't necessarily have to be 100% true, but they could be inspired by it. So shall we start to explore then the language in the poem? What sorts of techniques does the writer use to tell this story?
There's a lot of puns, so there's a lot of play on words throughout the poem. Straight away in the title for Sing Song, obviously Singh being a typical surname of someone who's from India. And it also has what's the word?
Like a musical?
A musical tone to it.
Yeah, it's quite sing song. I don't know, when you say it, you vary the tone of your voice, don't you?
Yeah.
So definitely, I think that's really prevalent all the way through this poem. There's a kind of lilt to it almost. It goes up and down, and when you're reading it, you almost can't help but read it in a certain rhythm and with a kind of musical quality to it. So that's really prevalent, and obviously the name itself obviously suggests that as well.
And it could also mimic the Indian language, because when you speak Punjabi, you tend to have quite a musical element to it. It's quite soft, and it has a rhythm usually.
Yeah, I think this poem, when you read it out loud especially, is just really pleasing to the ear. And I really like that it's written in this idiolect as well. It's written in the same, as if it's been spoken by the speaker. So we can imagine the speaker's accent, we can imagine the way the speaker perhaps uses certain words that aren't standard English. So it helps us to bring this character of the speaker to life. And it's quite childlike in parts as well, isn't it? We've got words like daddy, yeah, absolutely, and non-standard English as well, like I do de lock, for I lock the door. So we get a real sense of perhaps the difficulty in adjusting to speaking primarily in a language that's not your own. As well as that, there's a lot of sort of puns and plays on words, aren't there? Are there any that we would like to perhaps point out and expand on?
There's Putney in the second stanza, at the end of the second stanza. So obviously Putney is an actual place in London, but it's also another word for a woman or a wife. Yes. Is that in Punjabi? So in Punjabi, it's another word for woman or wife, but it's also a place in London. So it's that clashing of the cultures, the mixing of the cultures.
And as well as that, on the, I think, the fourth stanza, so we've got an image of his wife, and she's on the web playing with the mouse. So we can imagine, obviously, if she's on a computer, then she will have a mouse, and she might be on the internet, which is the World Wide Web. But we've also got some really playful imagery there that's almost like a spider and a mouse, or a cat and a mouse. So we've got this idea that the wife perhaps is controlling the situation that she's in. And it's quite unclear, actually, whether in this stanza it says that she's netting two cats on her Seek lover site. So she's perhaps on a dating site, which maybe implies that she's seeking other relationships. But the other way of looking at it is perhaps that she runs a dating site, which is, I suppose, quite a westernized practice, I suppose, in that she would be sort of setting people up and arranging dates for people. So again, we've got the sense that his wife is perhaps a real mix of the two cultures, the traditional culture that they come from, but also the new culture in Britain as well. And just to build on that a little bit, I think I've noticed quite a lot of juxtaposition in the poem as well, particularly when describing the bride. So a little bit further down, stanza 7, my bride, tiny eyes of a gun, and the tummy of a teddy. So we've got there two really clear metaphors, but that have very different images that have been thrown together to create a sense of contrast. So tiny eyes of a gun, quite hard, quite dangerous, quite menacing almost. But the tummy of a teddy implies she's very soft and very playful and quite childlike as well. So again, that reinforces this idea that his bride is almost exactly between two extremes of culture, or two extremes of experience.
Maybe she also has the eyes of a gun because she has to stand up for herself, especially when it was written in 1966. There's a lot of racism around, so she has to have a strong look, a strong presence. So I'm guessing he's the only person that can see her tummy. So then she can be softer with him, but she has to have strong eyes, so no one messes with her.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And in the stanza just following that, it talks about how she has a red crew cut, which is very short red hair. So again, very kind of non-traditional. And she wears a tartan sari. And a tartan is probably best known for, in the 1970s, it's a material that punks used to wear, who were people who would rebel against society. And they believed in anarchy, and they didn't believe in following everybody else's rules and following their expectations. So again, that kind of ties into what Mr. Singh, you were just saying, in that she perhaps feels like she has to be someone who stands up for herself, and she doesn't want to conform to what people expect her to be like. So we've got quite a sort of harsh but soft image of her there. How do we feel that the speaker feels about his bride? Because from that description, she's a real mixture of a character. What clues do we have about the speaker's feelings towards her?
Towards the end, so from the 5th paragraph to 5, 6, 7th paragraph, he mentions the bride at the beginning of each paragraph. So there's that repetition of bride, which shows that she is a priority to him. But it's interesting that he hasn't called her my wife, which could suggest that they are at the early stages of their relationship, and maybe in that honeymoon stage of the relationship where it's all about getting to know each other, loving each other, and it hasn't quite got serious yet. So, and you can tell that he is growing up, trying to balance his family life and his newfound relationship, and he does it, especially being from a background which is very family orientated. He doesn't know how to balance the two, but you can see towards the end of the poem, he is going more towards his bride or his wife, which shows that there's a difference in how first generation parents might have thought when they came to the UK. Because when they came to the UK, it was about creating a better life. That's why his parents created a shop so they had income. But his ideas are changing, and he wants love, and that's what he's exploring here.
Yeah, I think it becomes, the tone turns really romantic at the end of the poem. When we start, so it's the fifth stanza from the last, late in the midnight hour, when you shop as a wrap up quiet, when the precinct is concrete cool, you come down the stairs and sit on my silver stool. I think that's quite a romantic image, and you've got to remember that the setting that they're actually talking about is like presumably a fairly pokey corner shop. It's not particularly glamorous or beautiful environment for them to be sat in, but the language that he uses shows that he really treasures that experience where they get to sneak downstairs and sit together. The silver stool implying that even the very chair that she sits on is precious to him. It's a precious metal, it glistens. Moving on to the end of the poem, they start to speak in couplets, and they start to have a conversation almost where each one responds to the other. And again, that kind of shows, I think, how much that they mirror each other and how close they are emotionally, and how much they sort of value and treasure each other as well.
Also, the couplets at the end, I feel like as a reader, it almost feels like we're intruding in a conversation that's supposed to be between just them two alone. And also, there is a theory about when you like someone, you tend to mirror their behaviours and the way they talk, and that can be seen at the end of this poem as well.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, if we were thinking about sort of overall themes, there's quite a lot of poems in this anthology that are about boundaries, aren't there, and about how people can push against those boundaries and push against the expectations that people have of them. So take The Farmer's Bride, for instance. She pushes against the expectation, the patriarchal expectation that's been placed on her that she should be a demure black bride. In some ways, the bride in this poem is quite similar. She's rebelling against an expectation as well, but it's by mirroring the Western culture that she's perhaps grown up in or is trying to adopt and bring into her identity. Any other poems that are about boundaries that we might be able to link into this one? There's Walking Away, isn't there? We've got the idea of touch lines. Instead of it being a romantic relationship, it's about physical, about parental relationships and sort of moving away from the expectations of parents. But again, we've got a similar idea there.
Also, it sort of reminds me of how at the end of Mothering Distance and the end of Follower, where the son sort of decides that he doesn't need his parents and he's okay on his own, and they're a bit of a nuisance to him, or they just want to go and be free and live their own lives. This gives off a very similar sort of image in my head. So we've got the bride here now effing and making fun of my daddy, he says, and he still sides with her. So after all this time, I'm guessing he's been with his parents. He's only had his bride very, very recently, as we can see, and he still calls her his bride, but he's already siding with her, so he's already sort of pushed his family aside to take her side. So that's very sort of interesting how they've done it in this way.
You could apply a critical lens to that, couldn't you? You could think about whether she, if you were thinking about John Locke, for example, and his tabula rasa, the idea of nature versus nurture, is she adopting this culture because of the experiences that she's had in life, or was she always going to be a rebellious character? Is it the influence of the society around her, or is it part of who she is? And you could extend that to the speaker as well. How about the ladder of love? Because that's obviously something that we can apply to all of the poems in this anthology.
Well, we've got the playful love, which is a lot more obvious towards the end, as we talked about with the couplets and the romantic scene. But we've also got storage, so we've got some level of family relationship as well. But although we don't actually see any sort of conversation or any actual event where he has any sort of contact with his own parents, but that is there, and we can see that he's frustrated and he doesn't really get on with his parents, especially his dad.
So this is really a good poem to know for any assessment or exam, isn't it? Because it's actually the only one in the anthology that explores both types of relationship. You've got the family relationship between his parents, but you've also got the relationship that he has with his wife as well. So actually, no matter what poem you were given, you could compare it to this one. So if you were thinking, is there any poems in particular that are great to know? I would say that this one is a really good one. There's lots that you can talk about. There's lots that we haven't really had time to touch on today. But certainly something to have a think about. I think that's all we've got time for today. So thank you very much for joining us. Make sure to join us next week when we'll be doing a podcast for your next poem. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Uh,